Hello and welcome back to HEMA Fight Breakdowns. Today we are going to be going over a third place match from a tournament in Reykjavik, Iceland called Keppinautur. At least I think that's what it's called. Reykjavik, of course, is the land of names that I will never have any hope of pronouncing. So we're going to do our best. But in this match, we have another person who has been on the channel a few times before, Jayu Wu, and Peter Naslusen. Again, sorry if I pronounced that wrong. And this was a particularly interesting fight, not just because, we had some Americans go over to a foreign country and see how they perform, but particularly because there were a lot of low-line stabs in this fight. Now, I've talked about them on the channel before, but low-line stabs are a particularly difficult thing to try to work around. It's actually fairly common to see in the world of Olympic fencing, and occasionally if you hand a longsword to a high-ranking Olympic fencer, you're going to see a lot of low-line stabs. And the reason for that is obvious. It's really hard to parry a low-line stab. But in the world of HEMA, with afterblows, it's also really, really hard to defend yourself from a low-line stab and defend yourself after you land a low-line stab. So there's going to be a lot of really interesting adaptations that go on this fight, and they're all going to center around this one particular technique. Now, for this first exchange, we do see our first execution from both fighters here of a low-line stab, but from two different kind of perspectives. Now, Jayu, who is on the right here, is, as we know from watching some of his other footage, a rather defensive fighter. And when you're a defensive fighter, a lot of times you want to stand in a plow or a long point style guard because it's a great defensive guard from which you can protect your hands, your head, pretty much everything, and respond pretty appropriately with thrusts. However, when you are standing with your hands all the way down by your belt, your tip probably isn't going to be that much higher, which means a lot of the times when someone throws something at you, what you're really looking to do is parry or void and then just immediately send that thrust out there, and it might come in a little low. And that's pretty much exactly what happens here. Peter comes in, he throws his big jumping thrust, Jayu moves out of the way, clearly thinking that he was going to be able to completely void that attack, and he mostly does, at which point he just pushes his hands forward and delivers that thrust straight to the belly of Peter. Now, Peter does a pretty good job of following this up. He makes sure to deliver his own point as well, and they end up doubling out. But the first little key piece of information to learn here is that one of the reasons that the low stab can be a very viable option is that we, as human beings, have our arms attached to our shoulders, which means that everything we throw, if we want to make it a perfectly straight line towards our target, has to come at the level of the shoulders. So, if you want to throw a low-line stab, you are sacrificing reach, you are sacrificing range, but what you are gaining is the ability to always be able to work your point around your opponent's sword. A lot of swordplay, especially in the German tradition, likes to focus on bind work that happens at the level of high to high. Basically, both people have their arms extended from the level of their shoulders, and they're both trying to get over each other. Going under is a pretty great way to counter that in the sense that you'll be always able to deliver your point, but it's not a great counter in the sense that you can actually defend yourself from that high line. As we see here from Peter, if you stab low, well, there's nothing stopping anyone from hitting this upper part of your body. So you have to make 100% sure that if you're going to throw one of these low stabs, especially if you're moving backwards while you do it, that you're so far completely out of range that there's really no risk to you. Moving on to our second exchange, in this particular one, we see a reversal. Peter is now the person who throws the low-line stab, and Jay is the one who tries to counter it. And he tries to counter it in more or less the same way. But the difference between the last exchange and this exchange is that not only has the person who is throwing the low stab reversed, but the people who are the aggressor and the defender has stayed the same. So what we see here is an aggressive low stab from Peter. And again, we see some of the same principles at play. Because he dipped his body and his point and his hands so low, Jay had really no ability to parry it meaningfully and instead just got stabbed right in the belly. But because he was the one standing still and not really moving too far backwards, he also had his complete pick of these upper targets to hit. In this case, he went straight for the head. Now, this is another instance where we get to see the real weakness of the low line stab. And that is, again, it doesn't defend anything in your upper openings, which means the person, as long as they're paying attention, has the full ability to not only try to parry you and probably fail, but to then just hit you in the afterblow, because there is absolutely no defense that you can possibly bring to bear if you have already buried your sword into someone's belly. Similarly, though, another thing to point out is that in the previous exchange, Ju threw the low stab while going backwards, defensively trying to void an attack from his opponent. This could theoretically work because if someone misses, they're not necessarily always going to be able to throw a remise in time to save themselves or to just simply hit you. But if you're the one advancing forward and throwing the low stab, you are not only unable to defend yourself if you land it, but you're pretty much guaranteeing that as long as the other person just did any kind of effort to try to hit you, they're going to land it because you are the one closing distance as opposed to before where Jay was the one opening the distance. So now we come to the third exchange and we once again see some low stabs, only this time they come from both people. Now, one thing I mentioned earlier is that it's very common to see in longsword fencing two people who have their arms at the level of their shoulders competing to try to see who can thrust over the other person, trying to deliver a thrust of their own while boxing out their opponent. But now what we see is the exact same thing, but opposite. We see both of these fencers lowering their hand, trying to get into a competition of who can box out their opponent and stab low. And the principles of the physics of this interaction are really exactly the same as the one where both are trying to get above each other, only with some minor differences. So Peter once again comes forward with a thrust, and it was looking to be another low thrust. And what Jay does in order to respond is he lowers his guard even further, trying to push the strong of his blade into the weak of his opponent's, boxing him out and throwing a low thrust of his own. Now, if this was a high-to-high bind, this probably would have worked out, but it didn't work out so well in this instance, and that is because the leverage that you can get in a high-to-high bind is very different than the leverage you can get in a low-to-low bind. The reason for this is that, again, all of our arms are attached to our shoulders, and the kind of leverage and strength you can put behind a high bind is significantly higher than the kind of leverage and strength you can put behind a low bind. But as we know from studying German longsword and understanding that there are strong and weak binds, just because you're both in a weak position doesn't mean someone can't be stronger. And the way that you get to be in a strong position in a low to low bind is not by trying to get above your opponent, but by trying to push them off to a side or by moving your body out of the way. What you can see from this particular interaction is that when both people go low, Jay tries to take a center line position from which he can try to wind his opponent out of the way. And again, this would work perfectly great if it was a high bind. But because it's a low bind and because you're already sacrificing pretty much all of your range by going in low, Peter was able to very easily turn his sword off to a side and wind completely around any sort of box out attempt from Jay's blade. Meaning that if you're going to try to box out someone in a low-to-low bind, you can't really use the normal principles of binding and winding that would normally work for you up high. I'm going to jump around a little bit in chronological order here and show you the final exchange out of order. And the reason I'm going to show this is because from a teaching perspective, it makes a little bit more sense to talk about this exchange now as opposed to later, because what we see in this exchange is another adaptation to dealing with the low stab, but one that should come as pretty obvious to most people, and that is to just be a little bit higher. One thing about, again, human beings and their shoulders, and those pesky little attachments, is that anytime you want to get a mechanical advantage over someone who is low, you can always go just a little bit higher. If you go too high, you leave your belly completely open and you pretty much guarantee a double. But if you only go a little bit higher, what you do is you gain that little bit of extra range, that little bit of extra leverage, and that little bit of extra distance, and that can usually be more than enough in combination to give you a really, really dominant thrust. And that's what we see in this exchange. Peter comes in, once again, looking to feint, but then Jay kind of pushes him back a little bit with some pressure and then comes in with a low stab of his own, or at least it looked like it was going to be a low stab. What Jay really does here is that he comes forward on the right side of his body, ducks underneath, and then tries to assert over the top of what he assumed was going to be his enemy's low thrust. Now, his opponent, Peter, looks like he was standing in a thumb guard and then tried to parry this oncoming low thrust by just kind of pushing his flat of his sword down and just presenting his tip forward, really just throwing a low thrust. And so the reason that Jay was able to box him out is that when Peter came down, he through the weak of his sword onto the strong of Jay's blade, and as Jay raised the level of his thrust from being about hip level to being about sternum level, that was just enough of a wind up in order to get the mechanical advantage he needed to box out his opponent's sword. So comparing and contrasting that to the previous exchange where we saw something similar, Jay came in, threw a low thrust, but they weren't really able to box each other out at all because Peter responded to that previous one by lowering his hands, whereas he responded to this one by raising his hands a little bit and pushing them forward. That turned out to be a mistake at the end of the day, not so much because it wouldn't have landed, but because it happened to be coincidentally countered by what Jay was intending to do here. By trying to raise the level of the bind ever so slightly, you help cut out all of the problems of going too high against a low thrust, but still keep all the advantages of staying low against a low thrust. Now, the next exchange is a very simple one. It's just a hand shot, but it is very much worth pointing out because it is a very effective counter to people who like to low stab. But the reason isn't maybe so obvious. As I've said previously, when you are sitting in a plow or long point style position, you usually do so because your hands are actually quite protected. But what I don't always say when I talk about this is that one of the reasons that your hands are protected is because it's kind of assumed that your point is at the level higher than your hands. If you stand in a position, much like Peter here, where your point is not really that much higher than your hands, you are actually opening up the top of your wrists and your arms to being hit. It also means that if your response to any kind of oncoming stimuli is to simply lower your point and deliver a low thrust, you end up transitioning through that kind of bad low point plow position right as you're about to be delivering an attack of your own. So what Jay did here is he came forward, tapped his opponent's blade, tried to provoke that low thrust reaction, and succeeded. And the second Peter lowered his tip in order to get ready to deliver that low thrust, Jay simply came over the top, smacked him on the hands, and then got out of range, meaning that Peter was not in a position to deliver that low thrust, and even if he had tried to barrel through it, he probably wouldn't have had the range, because again, remember that when you're thrusting from low, the only way to get a straight line to your opponent is to raise back up to the level of your shoulders, meaning that if Peter had done that, he would have simply sent his hands directly into the path of Jay's sword, or in this case, when he didn't do that, just got hit in the hands and didn't have the range to reach his target. So that is going to be it for the video today. Hopefully you learned something about low thrusts and what you can do to counter them. But if not, I'm going to have another video out on Thursday, probably of this exact same tournament, so far as HEMA Scorecard can figure out who actually won, because I have video footage of what I think is the final match, and it doesn't match up with what HEMA Scorecard said happened. So we're going to figure that one out, and then we're going to deliver you another fight breakdown on Thursday, and I hope to see you there.